I thought my father abandoned me, until I found his letters hidden in the garage. The letters my father wrote, but never sent, would reveal the truth about the man I hated for 20 years. Hey, everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. Leo, 27 years old. That's who I was when I finally learned the truth about my father. For 20 years, I had built a life around the narrative that he was a selfish man who walked out on his family without a second glance. My mother had raised me alone, working 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads, while my father was out there somewhere, living his best life without us. Or so I thought. The day I found the letters was the same day I finally mustered the courage to clean out my father's garage. He had passed away 6 months earlier from a heart attack, and I had inherited his small house in a town I hadn't visited since I was 7. The garage had remained untouched, a dusty monument to the man I refused to forgive. It was filled with tools I never saw him use, fishing equipment he never took me fishing with, and boxes of memories I had no desire to revisit. I was pulling down old paint cans from a high shelf when a small wooden box tumbled down with them. It wasn't locked, just sealed with yellowed tape that had grown brittle with age. Something about it caught my attention. Maybe the way it was wrapped so carefully, or the neat handwriting on top that simply said, "For Leo." My name, in his handwriting after all these years. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside, nestled in yellowed newspaper, were dozens of envelopes, each addressed to me, each with a date stamped in the corner, none of them ever mailed. The first one was dated just 3 months after he left us. I sank to the concrete floor of that dusty garage, surrounded by the ghosts of my father's hobbies, and began to read. The first letter started with the words I never thought I'd see from him. "My dearest Leo, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to send these letters, or worse, something happened to me before I could come home." The handwriting was shaky at first, as if he struggled to form the words. He wrote about missing my 7th birthday, about how he cried when he saw a little boy in the park who reminded him of me. He apologized for leaving, but didn't yet explain why. He promised he would come back soon, that he was working on fixing things, that he loved me more than words could say. I couldn't breathe. 20 years of anger and resentment began to crumble around me. My mother had always said there was more to the story, that my father wasn't the monster I made him out to be. But I was 7 when he left, old enough to remember the shouting, the tears, the finality of his departure. I had built my identity around being the abandoned son, the survivor of a broken home. As I sat there, reading letter after letter, I realized that the man I had hated for most of my life had been writing to me all along. Each letter was a time capsule of his thoughts, his regrets, his love for me. They spanned years, each one dated and carefully preserved, waiting for a day I might find them. The sun was setting when I finally put the first few letters back in a box. My heart was racing, my mind reeling from the possibility that everything I believed about my father might be wrong. I needed to know more, needed to understand why he never sent these letters, why he never came back to us. As I locked up the garage for the night, I knew that tomorrow would bring more revelations, more truths that might shatter the carefully constructed walls around my heart. The next morning, I returned to the garage with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The wooden box sat exactly where I had left it, a silent repository of 2 decades of unsent words. I brought it inside, placing it on the kitchen table where my father used to drink his morning coffee, and continued reading where I had left off. The letters from the first year after he left were filled with explanations that never quite materialized. He wrote about needing to sort things out, about complications that kept him away. There were references to money troubles, to promises he had made that he couldn't break, but nothing concrete. What was clear was his torment. Each page was stained with what looked like tear spots, the handwriting growing more erratic as he described how much he missed me. In a letter dated 6 months after he left, he described seeing me in the grocery store with my mother. He had hidden behind a display of canned goods, watching me pick out a cereal I loved, wanting so badly to come forward but something holding him back. "You look so grown up already," he wrote. It killed me to think I was missing all these small moments that make up a life. By the second year of letters, a pattern emerged. He would write regularly, often multiple times a month, describing his attempts to return home. There were mentions of meetings with lawyers, of trying to secure a stable job, of waiting for the right time to come back. But something always went wrong. A job fell through, a legal complication arose, his health failed temporarily. What struck me most was how he never stopped asking about me. In every letter, he wondered if I was doing well in school, if I had friends, if I was happy. He remembered small details about me that even I had forgotten: my fear of thunderstorms, my love for strawberry ice cream, the way I tapped my fingers on the table when I was concentrating. He had been paying attention, even from afar. The third year brought a significant change in tone. The letters became more desperate, more filled with regret. He wrote about how he had tried to call on my 9th birthday, but couldn't bring himself to speak when my mother answered the phone. He described driving past our house late at night, just to catch a glimpse of my bedroom light, hoping I was safe and happy. It was in a letter from that year that I first learned about his illness. He mentioned seeing doctors, about a condition that required treatment, about how he didn't want to be a burden. He never specified what was wrong, but the worry in his words was palpable. "I can't come home like this," he wrote. "Not until I'm whole again. Not until I can be the father you deserve." As I read through these letters, a different picture of my father began to emerge. Not the selfish man who abandoned his family, but someone struggling with circumstances beyond his control, someone who cared deeply but was trapped by his own pride and circumstances. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the kitchen as I continued to read. The letters from the following years showed a man increasingly isolated from the life he had left behind. He wrote about moving to different towns, taking odd jobs, always planning to return, but never quite making it. There were fewer mentions of his health, but more about his loneliness, his regrets, his fear that too much time had passed for him to ever come back. In a letter dated when I was 15, he wrote about seeing my high school picture in the local newspaper, honor roll, perfect attendance. He had cut it out and kept it in his wallet. "I'm so proud of you," he wrote, "even though you don't know it. Even though you probably hate me." That line hit me like a physical blow. I didn't hate him. I had built my teenage identity around that hatred, around being the strong boy who didn't need a father. But now, reading these words, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Anger that he had put himself in this situation, pity for his isolation, and a growing curiosity about what had really happened all those years ago. As evening approached, I put the letters away, my mind racing with questions. Why had he never sent them? Why had he never returned? And most importantly, why had my mother never told me any of this? Tomorrow, I would need to confront the past more directly, to find answers that might change everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. The third day of discovery began with a decision. I needed to talk to my mother. For 20 years, she had been the sole keeper of our family's story, the narrator of how my father had abandoned us. But now, with a box full of letters contradicting everything I'd been told, I needed to hear her side of the story. I called her that morning, my heart pounding as I asked if we could meet. She suggested lunch at her favorite cafe, a small place with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. When I arrived, she was already seated at a corner table, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun she had worn for as long as I could remember. I didn't know how to begin, so I simply placed the wooden box on the table between us. Her face went pale as she recognized it, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch it. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In his garage," I replied. "After he died." She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I wondered what happened to it. He always said he kept it somewhere safe." For the next hour, as we picked at our food, my mother told me a story I had never heard. She confirmed that my father hadn't simply walked out on us, that there had been circumstances beyond his control. She spoke of his gambling addiction, something he had hidden from everyone, including her, until the debts became too large to ignore. "He didn't want to leave," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "But he was ashamed. He had gotten involved with some dangerous people, and he was worried they would come after us if he stayed. He thought if he left, he could handle it on his own, protect us. She told me about the night he left, how they had argued, not because he wanted to abandon us, but because he insisted on leaving to protect us. How he had promised to return as soon as he sorted everything out. How she had made him swear he would contact her regularly. He did, at first, she admitted. He would call from payphones. Letters would arrive with no return address. He was working odd jobs, trying to pay off the debts. But then, the calls stopped. The letters stopped coming. I didn't know if he was in trouble, or if he had just moved on. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. You were so young, she replied. And you were so angry. It seemed easier to let you believe he had just left than to explain something so complicated. As the years went on, it just got harder to tell the truth. After lunch, I returned to my father's house with a new understanding. The letters I read that afternoon took on a different meaning in light of what my mother had told me. The references to complications and things to sort out were clearly about his gambling debts. The meetings with lawyers, the job troubles, they all made sense now. In a letter from the 4th year after he left, he wrote about finally paying off the last of his debts, about how he was free to return home. But there was a new obstacle now, his health. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition, something that required expensive treatment and prevented him from working consistently. I thought once the debts were paid, everything would be simple, he wrote. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. Now I have to get healthy before I can come home. I don't want to be a burden to you and your mother. The following years of letters chronicled his health struggles. Medications that made it impossible to work, hospital stays that drained his savings, the fear that he would never be well enough to return. What struck me most was how he never lost hope, how he always ended each letter with the promise that he would come home soon. In a letter dated when I was 19, just before I left for college, he wrote about how proud he was of me for getting into university. Your mother told me all about it, he wrote. She still keeps me updated, bless her heart. I wish I could be there to see you off, to tell you in person how amazing you are. But know that I'm with you in spirit, cheering you on every step of the way. That revelation, that my mother had been in contact with him all these years, stunned me. When I called her that evening, she confirmed it. He would call occasionally, usually on my birthday or other important occasions. She would get him updates about my life, never revealing that they were still in touch. He always asked about you, she said. Always wanted to know if you were happy, if you needed anything. He sent money sometimes for your college fund. I never told you because I didn't want to confuse you. As I hung up the phone, I looked around the small house that had been my father's sanctuary for all these years. The furniture was worn but well cared for, the walls lined with photographs of me at various ages, of my mother, of family gatherings he had missed. He hadn't abandoned us at all. He had been watching from afar, loving us from a distance, trapped by circumstances and his own shame. The final batch of letters in the box were from the last year of his life. They were written with a sense of urgency, as if he knew his time was running out. He wrote about wanting to see me one more time, about hoping I would find these letters and understand. He wrote about his love for me, his pride in the man I had become, his regret for all the years we had lost. As I read the last letter, dated just a week before he died, tears streamed down my face. I hope you can forgive me, he wrote. I hope you can understand that I never stopped loving you, that I always wanted to be there for you. If you're reading this, know that I'm finally at peace, and that my greatest wish is for you to be happy, to live a full life, to know that you are always loved. That night, I slept in my father's house for the first time, surrounded by his things, his letters, his love. The anger and resentment that had fueled me for 20 years had been replaced by a profound sadness, a longing for the relationship we had lost, and a determination to honor his memory by understanding the complete truth of his story. The morning after my conversation with my mother brought a new clarity. I wasn't just reading letters anymore. I was piecing together a life, reconstructing the man I'd spent 2 decades despising. With fresh coffee in hand, I returned to the kitchen table, where the wooden box sat waiting, its secrets yet to be fully revealed. Today, I focused on the letters from my early 20s, a period when I was building my career, establishing my independence, and moving further away emotionally from the memory of my father. During those years, I had barely thought of him, except on rare occasions when something would trigger a memory, a father-son event at a friend's family, a casual mention of someone's dad, the ache of his absence on particularly difficult days. What I discovered in those letters was that while I was moving forward, my father was still stuck in the past, still planning his return, still loving me from afar. He wrote about following my career through my mother's updates, about cutting out articles from the local paper when my work was featured, about how he would drive by my office building sometimes just to feel closer to me. In a letter dated when I was 23, he wrote about seeing me with my first serious girlfriend. "You looked so happy," he wrote. "It hurt to see someone else walking beside you, someone else making you smile, but it also made me glad to know you weren't alone. I've always wanted you to be happy, even if it couldn't be with me." That letter was particularly difficult to read. I remembered that relationship, remembered how I had introduced the young woman to my mother, how she had seemed sad but supportive. Now I wondered if she was thinking about my father, about the man who should have been there to give his approval, to offer some fatherly advice. As I continued reading, I noticed a shift in the letters around the time I turned 25. The tone became more urgent, more focused on the possibility of reconciliation. He wrote about his health improving, about finally having a stable job, about how he was saving money to come home. "I know it's been a long time," he wrote in a letter from that period. "I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to, but I'm ready now, ready to face the consequences, ready to beg for your forgiveness if that's what it takes. I just want to see you one more time, to tell you in person how sorry I am, how much I've missed you." What struck me about these letters was how my father never blamed me for his absence, never made excuses for his failures. He took full responsibility for the choices that had led to this situation, even as he explained the circumstances that had constrained him. There was a humility in his words that I never would have expected from the arrogant man I had imagined him to be. In a letter dated just a year before he died, he wrote about finally making concrete plans to return. He had bought a plane ticket, had spoken with my mother about the best way to approach me, had even rehearsed what he would say. But then his health took a turn for the worse, a heart attack that landed him in the hospital for weeks. "The doctors say I need to take it easy," he wrote, his handwriting shakier than usual. "They say another heart attack could be fatal. I'm scared, Leo, not of dying, but of dying without ever seeing you again, without ever making things right." That letter was accompanied by a small photograph, faded with age. It was of him, standing in front of a small house that looked like it might be his. He was older than I remembered, with graying hair and lines around his eyes, but there was something familiar in his smile, something that reminded me of my own reflection. As I studied the photograph, I realized that I had been looking for my father in strangers' faces for years, wondering if the man I passed on the street might be him. Now, finally, I had a picture of him as he was in recent years, not the young man from my childhood memories, but the middle-aged man he had become. The final letters in the box were the most difficult to read. Written in the months leading up to his death, they were filled with a sense of urgency, of time running out. He wrote about his love for me, his pride in the man I had become, his regret for all the years we had lost. In the last letter, dated just a week before he died, he wrote about making one final attempt to reach out to me. "I'm going to call you," he wrote. "I know it's been 20 years. I know you might hang up, but I have to try. If you're reading this, and I never called, it means something happened, that I didn't get the chance. But know that I was thinking of you, that I loved you until my very last breath." That letter broke something open inside me. All these years, I had thought he didn't care, that he had forgotten about me, moved on to a new life, a new family. But the truth was that he had been writing to me, thinking about me, loving me from afar, trapped by circumstances and his own shame. As I sat there, surrounded by his words, his thoughts, his love, I felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the father I had lost, but for the relationship we could have had, for the years we could have shared. I also felt a growing determination to honor his memory, to understand the complete truth of his story, and perhaps to find a way to forgive both him and myself for the years of anger and misunderstanding. The afternoon was waning as I carefully placed the last letter back in a box. Outside, the world went on, oblivious to the emotional earthquake I was experiencing. But inside, everything had changed. The man I had hated for 20 years was no longer a monster in my mind, but a complex, flawed human being who had loved me the best way he could under difficult circumstances. Tomorrow, I would need to make some decisions about what to do with this new understanding, how to incorporate it into my life, how to move forward with this knowledge. But for now, it was enough to sit with the truth, to let it wash over me, to begin the process of healing a wound I hadn't even realized was still open. The 5th day of my journey into my father's past began with a realization. I needed to understand the complete picture, not just his side of the story. The letters had revealed his thoughts, his regrets, his love for me, but there were still gaps, pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. I decided to visit the local library, to look through old newspapers, to try to find traces of the man he had become during his years away. The library was a small brick building, smelling of old books and floor wax. The reference librarian, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, helped me access the newspaper archives on the microfiche machine. As I scrolled through years of local history, I found small traces of my father's presence in the town, mentions of his employment at various businesses, a notice about his volunteer work at the community center, even a letter to the editor about improving local parks. What struck me was how he had built a quiet life for himself, how he had become part of the community without ever revealing his true identity or his past. He was known as a reliable worker, a kind neighbor, a man who kept to himself but was always willing to help when needed. The most significant discovery came in an article from 5 years before he died. It was about a local charity event, a fundraiser for children with heart conditions. There, in a photograph of the volunteers, was my father standing behind a table, a small smile on his face. The caption identified him as Robert Thompson, longtime volunteer and fundraiser. Robert Thompson, not his real name, but the name he had used to build a new life, to become someone else entirely. As I read the article, I learned that he had been volunteering with the charity for years, raising money to help children with heart conditions receive treatment. The irony was painful. He was helping others with the very condition that had kept him away from his own family. I made copies of the article and photograph, my hands shaking as I realized the significance of what I had found. My father hadn't just been hiding from his past. He had been building a new identity, contributing to his community in meaningful ways, perhaps trying to atone for his mistakes through service to others. That afternoon, I decided to visit the address listed in the article for the charity organization. It was a small office in a converted house, with colorful children's drawings on the walls and a friendly atmosphere. The director, a woman in her 40s with a warm smile, remembered my father well. Robert was one of our most dedicated volunteers, she said, her eyes softening with memory. He never talked about his past, never mentioned family. But he was passionate about our work, especially when it came to helping children get the treatment they needed. When I asked why he was so committed to this particular cause, she hesitated for a moment before answering. He never said explicitly, but I got the impression he had a personal connection. Once, after a particularly successful fundraiser, he got emotional and said something about wishing he could have done more for his own child. That statement hit me hard. All these years, I had thought he had forgotten about me, moved on without a second glance. But here was evidence that he had been thinking of me, trying to help others in a way he couldn't help me, perhaps trying to make up for his absence through his service to the community. The director offered to connect me with another volunteer who had worked closely with my father. We met the next day at a local coffee shop, a man named Henry who had known my father for over a decade. Robert was a private man, Henry said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. But we became friends over the years. He never talked about his past, but sometimes, late at night, after a long day of volunteering, he would get this sad look in his eyes. He would mention having a son, someone he missed terribly. Henry told me about my father's dedication to the charity, about how he would work extra hours to ensure they met their fundraising goals, about how he would personally visit sick children in the hospital, bringing toys and encouragement. He had this way with kids, Henry said with a smile. They loved him. He would tell them stories, make them laugh, take their minds off their illnesses for a little while. It was like he was making up for lost time, like he was trying to be the father he couldn't be to his own child. As I listened to Henry's stories, a new picture of my father began to emerge, not just as a man trapped by circumstances, but as someone trying to make amends, trying to create meaning in a life separated from his family. He had built a new identity, but he hadn't forgotten who he was, who he had left behind. The most surprising revelation came when Henry mentioned a small box my father had left with him for safekeeping. He said it was important, that it contained something he wanted his son to have if he ever found him. He gave it to me about a year before he died, said he had a feeling his time was running out. My heart raced as Henry retrieved the box from his car. It was similar to the one I had found in the garage, but smaller, more ornate. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a collection of items. A silver locket with my baby picture inside, a dried flower from the garden of our old house, a series of photographs of me at various ages, clearly taken from a distance. At the bottom of the box was an envelope addressed to me in my father's handwriting. With trembling hands, I opened it and read the words that would change everything once again. "My dearest Leo," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found your way to me, or at least to the life I built in your absence. I want you to know that the man you've heard about, Robert Thompson, was me trying to be better, trying to atone for the mistakes I made, trying to make a difference in the world even when I couldn't be part of yours." He went on to explain that he had changed his name not to hide from his past, but to protect me from the people he owed money to, from the dangerous connections he had made through his gambling. He had created a new identity to ensure that no one could trace him back to me, to his family. "I've thought about revealing myself so many times," he wrote, "but I was always afraid that my past would catch up with me, that it would put you in danger. So I stayed away, loving you from a distance, hoping that someday, somehow, we could be reunited." As I read those words, sitting in that coffee shop with a man who had known my father as Robert Thompson, I felt the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. My father hadn't just abandoned me. He had made a sacrifice, choosing to stay away to protect me, living a lonely life so that I could have a safe one. The weight of 20 years of resentment lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of understanding, of connection to the man I had never really known. He wasn't perfect, he had made terrible mistakes, but he had also made sacrifices, tried to atone, loved me in the only way he could. As I left the coffee shop, the small box of treasures in my hands, I knew that my journey of discovery was almost complete. There was still one more thing I needed to do, one more step in the process of understanding and forgiveness. Tomorrow, I would visit his grave, not with anger or resentment, but with gratitude, with a new understanding of the man who had loved me enough to stay away. The final day of my journey into my father's past dawned clear and bright, a perfect spring day that seemed incongruent with the somber purpose ahead. I had spent the previous night reading through the letters one more time, this time with the full context of his life as Robert Thompson, as a volunteer, as a man trying to atone for his mistakes. Today, I would visit his grave, not as the abandoned son seeking closure, but as someone who finally understood. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking the town, a peaceful place with old trees and well-tended graves. My father's plot was simple, marked by a modest headstone with his real name, Richard Thompson, and the dates of his birth and death. Beneath his name was an inscription, "Loved and missed always." I had brought flowers, not because I thought he would see them, but because it felt like the right thing to do, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. As I placed them on the grave, I noticed another arrangement already there. Fresh flowers, clearly recently placed. I wondered who had left them, who else remembered him, who else mourned his passing. I sat on the grass beside the grave, the box of letters beside me, and began to speak, not to the headstone, but to the memory of the man I was just getting to know. I told him about finding the letters, about learning the truth, about meeting Henry and the director of the charity. I apologized for my anger, for the years I'd spent hating him, for not trying to understand sooner. "I wish I had known," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I wish I had known that you were thinking of me, that you loved me, that you were trying to protect me." But I understand now, and I forgive you. I hope you can forgive me too." As I sat there, a woman approached hesitantly, her steps slowing as she saw me beside the grave. She was in her late 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, similar to the ones already on the grave. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said softly. "I just came to pay my respects. Were you a friend of Richard's?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm his son." The woman's eyes widened with surprise and recognition. "Leo? He talked about you sometimes. I'm Margaret, his neighbor. I lived next door to him for the last 10 years of his life." We sat together on the grass, two strangers connected by the man who had been a father to one and a friend to the other. Margaret told me about my father's life in the small house on the hill, about his quiet routines, his kindness, his moments of sadness when he thought no one was watching. "He never talked about his past," she said, arranging her flowers beside mine. "But sometimes on your birthday, he would get this faraway look in his eyes. Once, he told me he had a son, someone he loved very much but couldn't be with. He said he hoped you were happy, that you had a good life." Margaret's words filled in the final gaps in my understanding of my father's life during his years away. He hadn't been completely alone. He had neighbors who cared about him, friends who knew him as Robert Thompson, the quiet man who volunteered and kept to himself. He had built a life, however small and isolated, separate from the one he had left behind. "He was proud of you, you know," Margaret continued, her voice soft. "He had a box of your pictures, ones he had taken from a distance or gotten from your mother. He would look at them sometimes, with this mixture of love and regret in his eyes. He never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping that someday you might understand." As we talked, I realized that Margaret was the one who had been leaving the fresh flowers on the grave, continuing her ritual of visiting her old friend even after he was gone. I invited her to join me for lunch, and over sandwiches at a local cafe, we shared stories of the man we had both loved in different ways. Margaret told me about my father's final days, about how his health had deteriorated, about how he had spoken of me with increasing urgency. "He was worried that you would never know the truth," she said. "He had written these letters, but he was afraid you would never find them, that you would go through your whole life believing he had abandoned you. He told me once that his greatest regret wasn't the gambling or the debts or even the illness," Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. "It was the time he had lost with you, the years he could never get back. He said if he could go back and change one thing, it would be finding another way to protect you without staying away." After lunch, Margaret and I returned to the cemetery. She had to leave, but not before giving me a hug and promising to stay in touch. Alone again at my father's grave, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The anger and resentment of 20 years finally giving way to understanding and forgiveness. I took one last look at the headstone, at the inscription that now held new meaning for me. Loved and missed always, not just by me, but by the friends he had made as Robert Thompson, by the children he had helped through his volunteer work, by the community he had served quietly and without recognition. As I left the cemetery, the box of letters in my arms, I knew that this journey of discovery had changed me profoundly. The man I had hated for most of my life was no longer a villain in my story, but a complex, flawed human being who had made terrible mistakes, but had also made sacrifices, who had loved me the best way he could under difficult circumstances. In the weeks that followed, I began the process of integrating this new understanding into my life. I talked with my mother about my father, sharing the letters, the stories from Margaret and Henry, the photograph of him as Robert Thompson. We cried together, mourning the years we had lost, celebrating the man we were just getting to know. I continued my father's volunteer work with the charity, finding meaning in carrying on his legacy, in helping children in a way he couldn't help me. I even kept in touch with Margaret, sharing stories of my father, piecing together the complete picture of the man who had been both Richard and Robert, both father and stranger. The letters remained in the wooden box, a tangible connection to the father I had lost and found again. Sometimes, on difficult days, I would take them out and read through them, finding comfort in his words, in the knowledge that I had been loved, even when I felt most alone. 20 years of anger and resentment couldn't be erased overnight, but with understanding came forgiveness. With forgiveness came healing. My father hadn't abandoned me. He had made a sacrifice, choosing to stay away to protect me, living a lonely life so that I could have a safe one. As I moved forward with my life, I carried with me not just the pain of the past, but the wisdom gained from understanding, the strength that comes from forgiveness, the love that transcends time and distance. I had spent 20 years hating a man I didn't really know. Now, I would spend the rest of my life honoring the father I was just getting to know.